Zulfi Bhutto of Pakistan. His Life and Times by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 11, Foreign Crimes and Domestic Tragedies. April 1973 to 1974. The next day, Bhutto addressed members of the National Press Club, informing them that the new Pakistan was determined to nurture democratic institutions. The new constitution ensures the maximum autonomy to all federal units, while it safeguards national solidarity. Socially and economically, Pakistan was forward looking and soon would be no longer dependent on the assistance of its friends. In a joint statement issued on the eve of Bhutto's departure from Washington on 20th September, Nixon promised strong US support to Pakistan, and Bhutto promised to try better to control narcotics traffic and to eliminate poppy cultivation. That night, Bhutto addressed the 28th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations in New York. Pakistan would not recognize Bangladesh, he reiterated, until all 195 of the Pakistani prisoners still held for possible trial were released and repatriated. He no longer hoped to win Mujib over to his earlier Commonwealth concept of federation, but still dreamed of resurrecting pan Islamic ties, of restoring fraternal sentiments with Bangladesh that might help erase the traumatic memories of the darkest days of 1971. Turning to India, Bhutto argued that but for the unresolved dispute over the state of Jammu and Kashmir, Pakistan had no territorial ambitions. If we support the cause of Jammu and Kashmir, as we must, it is because the right of the people of Kashmir to decide their future has been recognized by India and expressly pledged to them by the United Nations. The resolutions of the United Nations on Kashmir have not been implemented, and the dispute has festered and held constant strife and major conflicts in the last 25 years. To remind the world community of its responsibility to ask for the fulfillment of the pledges solemnly given and 100 times repeated is not to seek confrontation but rather the only way to avert conflict. The important issue of self determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, to which the United Nations and both India and Pakistan are committed, will have to be faced and honorably resolved for the good of all of us. On Kashmir, Zulfi Bhutto had always been a passionate yet principled statesman and patriot, one of whom every Pakistani could be proud, as all of them were, who heard him eloquently articulate his nation's plea for sanity and justice in the relations between Pakistan and India. With long divided Germany and Korea moving toward peaceful settlement of their disputes and with the Vietnam War finally over, Bhutto wisely noted that the peoples of the world, the youth at least, are turning away from the narrow appeal of national or doctrinal prejudice. Why should not India and Pakistan and Bangladesh join that promising parade towards a more rational future? Even the superpowers were moving inexorably in the direction of detente. Who is there indeed that would not applaud the relaxation of tensions that cast their somber shadows over the entire globe? If it was a long road, Zulfi presciently warned, from confrontation between the great powers to conciliation. It might prove an even longer one to the ideal of cooperation worldwide. He pledged Pakistan's support to all genuine movements for emancipation of the people from alien domination. This was the cause of the Third World. It is the struggle of Asia and Africa. It engages us emotionally and enlists our wholehearted sympathy. Though Pakistan had to date been excluded from the Conference of Non-Aligned Countries because of its commitments to SEATO and CENTO, Zulfi hoped not only to join the conference but to lead the Third World, that major segment of humanity which felt the stirrings of a revolution that could never be suppressed. Bhutto waxed ever more eloquent, proudly proclaiming, "We are all the children of revolution, a revolution whose onward march may sometimes be arrested by our own weaknesses and contradictions, but cannot be stopped by any force in the world." But we, in the Third World, should not be swayed by conspiratorial theories and forget the fact that the fault lies on the ground and within ourselves. To quote Meredith, "We are betrayed by what is false within." Alas, Bhutto often understood the Zulfi side of himself far better than he managed to control it. Bhutto also spoke to the Foreign Policy Association and the Asia Society while in New York, and 2 days later was the guest speaker on the popular television program Meet the Press on the eve of his flight home. When asked if he feared that big power detente posed serious dangers to other parts of the world, Zulfi responded that the great ones should realize that the romance of revolution prevails over the machinations of great or small powers. He was reminded that as a student in California, he had worked for Helen Gahagan Douglas in her congressional campaign against Richard Nixon, and was asked if he thought Nixon had used tactics in that campaign similar to those he had used in Watergate. "I don't remember that campaign," Zulfi replied. "I was intensely involved. I was a foreign student and I thought that she should be supported because she was a woman." He was welcomed back to Pindi's International by a noisy crowd of supporters and admirers, some of whom were less than attentive during the playing of Pakistan's anthem. "I noticed just now that somebody was playing a record," Zulfi scolded, while some others were raising slogans. "Playing of the national anthem is a very solemn occasion when everyone should remain silent." Similarly, when the Holy Quran was being recited, some of my friends were raising slogans. "It is my duty to tell you that this is wrong." Nixon's verbal construction seems to have caught the Prime Minister's ear, but then he must have noticed how his greeters reacted to his pedagogic scolding and softened his tone. "Since I am talking to you not as Prime Minister, but as your brother, I am telling you these things." Then he reported on a successful trip. "I could have done no more." The following day, 28th September, the first batch of Pakistani prisoners of war returned from India. Prime Minister Bhutto welcomed them to a new Pakistan, a vibrant, imbued Pakistan, with the urge and determination to forge ahead and carve out its rightful destiny. Much though Bhutto spoke of the new Pakistan, it was Khar and Mumtaz, Jitoi and Pirzada who continued to stand or sit beside him while all the old intractable problems of poverty and feudal inequities, provincial conflicts and tribal disorders plagued and confounded their heroic attempts to cope or solve, even as nature heaped floods on top of prolonged drought. Export earnings prior to the floods had been so promising, cotton leading the way toward what looked like a major economic turning point, that Zulfi felt optimistic about full recovery. After the floods of August, however, high surtaxes had been added to virtually all imports, stimulating urban discontent. Last quarter strikes, protest marches, and riots. Zulfi's costly new elite federal security force provided him ample protection and information, but were never otherwise deployed. Haq Nawaz Tiwana, first Director General of the Federal Security Force, was soon to be replaced by much shrewder, more experienced Masood Mahmood, who had been introduced to Zulfi Bhutto in 1958 at the bar of their club by Police Inspector General Ikram Khan. Bhutto had probably consumed half a dozen martinis, Mahmud estimated, recalling that meeting, and had muttered, "I know Masood," waving aside Ikram Khan's more formal introduction. "You'd better call me Zulfi," he told the man who was later to become his closest confidant, and then the approver whose evidence would help send Bhutto to the gallows. "Or I'll slap you." They hit it off well from the start. Masood liked Bhutto's genial, convivial manner and his sense of humor, though, as Masood recalled, he was the worst lecher. Having entered the Indian Police Service in 1945 after graduating from Lahore College and studying law for 2 years in Lincoln's Inn in London, Masood was a man of wide-ranging experience and sophistication. He was very attentive listener, moreover, and still enjoyed a martini or two himself, very dry. On 28 September 1973, a fourth attempt was made on the life of Wali Khan as he was driving in his jeep from Mardan to Sawat. The outspoken opposition National Awami Party's leaders, driver and bodyguard were both killed, but Wali Khan walked away unscathed. Bhutto's tour of the northwest frontier, scheduled to start the following week, was immediately cancelled. Zulfi flew instead on 2nd October from Lahore to Karachi, where he received a regal welcome. Though the month-long Ramadan fast had begun and Karachi was sweltering in 100-degree heat, the airport reception crowd was impressive. Thousands of school children waved Pakistani flags as he drove from the airport, and sweating workers, given time off on this special holiday, turned out to greet their Qaid-e-Awam. From Karachi, Zulfi flew to Larkana. He was still relaxing in his newly air-conditioned home there at the start of the Ramadan Yom Kippur War in Israel that October 1973. Zulfi could hardly contain his delight as word reached him of the two-pronged Arab attack against Israel, launched without warning on the Day of Atonement and fasting by Egyptian and Syrian forces. He quickly wired UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, urging fulfillment of Security Council Resolution 242. Zulfi told his service chiefs with whom he met in Pindi on 11th October. "A ceasefire will not do. It is essential that Arab territories held by Israel, illegally by Israel, should be vacated." Zulfi now launched a historic initiative towards a second Islamic summit, inviting the heads of all Arab and Islamic nations to meet in Lahore the following February. It was his most important innovation. His daughter, Benazir, reflected during her own later brief tenure as Prime Minister. He gave Pakistan this linkage to the countries of Gulf. On defense lines, on economic lines, on foreign policy lines, he carved out this bloc of Islamic countries, uniting the countries of the Muslim world, which gave birth not only to the Islamic Conference but also to a newfound assertiveness. To have unified action, to send soldiers abroad. He sent labor abroad. After my father's death, Zia tried to say that Zia, was a soldier of Islam, but he was a soldier of the devil. The first Islamic summit at Rabat in 1969 had been attended by only 24 of the 30 invited states, including India, much to Pakistan's frustration and dismay. The Lahore summit, however, thanks to Zulfi's strenuous personal efforts and singular energy, would lure no fewer than 38 Muslim states to Pakistan and proved to be Bhutto's greatest diplomatic triumph. It attracted every major Muslim head of state except the Shah of Iran, who was smarting over Zulfi's unstable report about him to Nixon. Bhutto flew to Tehran in mid-October 1973 to try to reassure the Shah and mend fences he had destroyed in what he thought was an off-the-record remark in the White House. The Shah was cool to Zulfi's apology and rejected his invitation to the summit. Zulfi felt convinced He later wrote that the Shah had a complex towards me. He was intensely envious. His grandiose designs and fanciful ambitions of being the modern Cyrus the Great, if not greater, contributed in no small measure to his ruin. He lost all touch with reality. Zulfi wired messages of support and sympathy on 16th October to President Hafiz al-Assad of Syria and Hassan al-Bakr of Iraq in their struggle on behalf of the indomitable Arab nation against the Israeli aggressor. The same day, he also wired King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and King Hussein of Jordan that the government and people of Pakistan have always fully supported the cause of Arab people and will continue to do so. At a press conference in Karachi 4 days later, Bhutto said that in the current Middle East conflict, the whole of Muslim world is on trial. Pakistan is not a non-aligned state. Pakistan is finally aligned to the principle of justice and international law and to a durable structure of international peace. Pakistan was doing everything within our power and capacity to help the Arab position and to give tangible support to the Arab states in their struggle. It must be remembered that a war is being waged, every minute is precious, and every action has to be taken deliberately. Zulfi announced, "It is not possible for me to make full revelation of all our efforts. We know the people of Pakistan have faith in their government and in the successful execution of this jihad." While Bhutto busied himself with pan-Islamic affairs and secret plans of amassing a nuclear arsenal for Pakistan, the internal situation deteriorated in Sindh as well as in Balochistan and all along the northwest frontier. The former governor of Sindh, Mir Ali Ahmad Talpur, found the country drifting towards strife, chaos, and disintegration. The present Pakistan government seems to be intent on pushing it over the precipice. Its actions in Balochistan are nothing short of anti-national. In frontier, it seems to be pushing straight for a showdown with the democratic forces. The Punjab is being ruled through simple gangsterism, and Sindh is deplorable, people dying in encounters with police. As for Mr. Bhutto, if he stays, the country cannot survive. He is really a showboy. The reality behind his rule is something very ugly. Governor Bugti resigned on the last day of October 1973, writing to say that he had earlier accepted responsibility for the administration of his province, with the thought and intention of being able to do justice for the downtrodden masses of Balochistan. But, in spite of my best efforts, things don't seem to get done as I would want them done, and are not allowed to be got done. Zulfi suspected that Bugti only wanted more power and might rest content with elevation under the new constitution to the chief ministership of Balochistan, which was the democratic job former Governor Khar had now taken for himself in Punjab. Khar was sent on a secret mission in early November, therefore, to try to talk to Bugti into staying on, for the insurrection in Balochistan kept getting harder to handle. Zulfi may also have hoped that his big three prisoners, Bizinjo, Mengal, and Murray, might actually agree to form a new, even more popular Balochistan cabinet. But though he had air-conditioned their Sihala rest house prison, none of those redoubtable National Awami Party leaders would even begin to consider any political deal while they remained under armed guard. Zulfi's most trusted Balochi supporter was conservative Sardar Ghaus Bakhsh Resani, who had been governor before Bazinjo and would soon be reappointed to that job by his prime minister. Resani now still served as Zulfi's Minister for Food, Agriculture and Rural Development and regularly sent secret reports to Bhutto about how badly Bugti and his comrades behaved. Bugti himself made no secret of his frustrations with the central government, and whenever interviewed by a foreign correspondent, confessed that the area of insurgency in Balochistan was increasing. as was the death toll of Pakistani soldiers as well as Murri and Mengal tribesmen, thousands of whom would be killed in the next year of that secret, bloody civil war. US Secretary of State Kissinger, en route to China, stopped at Pindi for dinner with Prime Minister Bhutto in early November to discuss the ever troublesome problems of the Middle East. We have a vital stake in the region, Zulfi told him. We have taken a position which we believe is based on principles. We shall remain in touch with our Arab friends, and whatever modest contribution Pakistan can make for a just settlement, we shall always be available. I want you to remember that in Pakistan, we have had our problems. We have broken the back of our basic problems. Less than a month later, French Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs Jean Dilipkowski flew in for top secret meetings with Bhutto, but Kissinger was kept informed of them by cipher messages transmitted from the sealed telecommunications chamber in the new US Embassy compound in the diplomatic quarter of Islamabad. Bhutto sought to cement Pakistani ties with Turkey by ordering erection of the Kemal Ataturk Memorial in his hometown of Larkana to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Turkish Republic on 30th November. I make no secret of the pleasure I feel at building this memorial at a place where in my boyhood, I read about Ataturk and marveled at his courage, his lucidity, and his determined fight against reactionism and obscurantism. The Turkish Minister of State for Land Reforms flew in for the gala ceremony and stayed with the Bhuttos at Al Murtaza, outside of which a monument to commemorate the achievements of President Sukarno of Indonesia was being erected. In several respects, both men had been political role models for Bhutto. Ataturk igniting his passion for pan-Islamic unity and Muslim modernism. Sukarno stimulating other passions including his resolve to be free of any superpower control. The 20th of December 1973 marked the second anniversary of Zulfi's rise to presidential, now prime ministerial power. His adept dance at the top had rendered all his angry critics and formidable adversaries helpless. Though the political opposition still sniped at him daily, from the left as well as the right wings of his own party and every other tribe or group, nothing brought him down. Indeed, nothing seemed to touch or faze him. He moved smiling or scowling through the worst weather, the harshest accusations, the loudest epithets, as though coated invisibly with impervious plastic, fearless, death defying, power affirming. The crowds continued to love him, cheer him, laugh with him, for he always told them a spicy joke or 20, and all of his gestures were fun to watch, as was his remarkably expressive face. His voice, moreover, was a miracle of primal energy, its potent power rumbling, echoing, uplifting. He raised the spirits of the saddest, poorest Harris and raged tribesmen and of the oldest as well as the youngest women, many of whom walked miles just for a glimpse of him or to hear the tintillating cadences of his honeyed tongue. He was the living image, the three-dimensional vital incarnation of many Pakistanis' wishful dream of themselves. Tough yet tender, a practical idealist, smart as a cat o' nine tails whip. Swifter on the draw than a Texas cowboy, and better in bed or as the head of the state than any Indian, Russian, or Englishman. He was Qaide Awam, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. What did it matter if roti, kapda, or makan all cost so much more nowadays? Election slogans were forgotten the world over, and inflation was a universal problem, was it not? You know how it is, Zulfi admitted to an Indian journalist who had flown in that December to interview him. People are charlatans. They want some pecuniary benefits. They put it in the garb of some noble ideal and say that I have to fight in elections. I need funds. I have to buy cars. I have to pay workers. This is needed to buy this, and that is needed to buy that. After all, there is inflation in the world. People find it difficult to work out a living, and so they enchant people that I am a guerrilla leader and I can do this and I can do that. Enchanting people was what Zulfi did best. He had always been enchanting. From his earliest years in Larkana through his salad days in Bombay and Karachi and California. He had the gift, the eyes, the voice, the power to enchant, to mesmerize, bewitch, enthrall. He had fingers so remarkably tender and dexterous that his mere touch could be felt, remembered for more than a decade by at least one Pakistani beauty, whose cherubic face had smiled up at him as he entered a ballroom, filling it instantly, that young star recalled, with his magical presence. Prime Minister Bhutto laid the first brick of Karachi's long-awaited steel mill at Pipri on 30th December 1973. The mill would be constructed with Soviet aid, marking the dawn of a new era of Pakistani technical maturity, as well as international collaboration in this particular field. It would help organize the defense potential of Pakistan on a scientific basis. Zulfi noted, and Port Qasim, currently under construction next to Karachi's older port and shipyards, would be used to expedite the mill's completion. He had flown to Karachi at year's end not only to launch the new steel mill but also to address the annual Sindh convention of his People's Party. The gala two-day gathering of Sindh's political elite was held in Karachi's new National Stadium Hall, decked outside and in with enormous hardboard pictures of Chairman Bhutto, looking a bit like Chairman Mao, his Achkan collar open, an enigmatic smile on his pudgy-chinned face, the fast thinning hair gone white, a fitting portrait of this people's prime minister. A few days before the convention began, Zulfi had replaced Mumtaz Bhutto with Ghulam Mustafa Jatoi as Chief Minister of Sindh. Too many reports about Mumtaz's inability to keep Karachi clean and safe and to control his cabinet and his own nocturnal wild boar hunting had reached Zulfi's ears. He continued, of course, to trust and repose full faith in his brother. But even Mumtaz had complained about having worked myself into a dangerous state of health and insisted that for his own branch of the family, monetarily, our position has become disastrous. So Zulfi decided to give Mumtaz a well-deserved rest and to elevate Jatoi from the Ministry of Railways he had only grudgingly agreed to head to the job he had set his heart and sights on long before Zulfi Bhutto came to power. As Central Minister of Railways, Jatoi had merely been able to order a new railway station built in his Vadero capital of Nawab Shah. But as Chief Minister of Sindh, he would virtually be able to bring Nawab Shah to Karachi and vice versa. Robust Chief Minister Jatoi entered the Karachi Convention Hall shortly before noon on that last day of 1973 and was pleased to note that Mumtaz had absented himself. Jatoi acknowledged the cheers of his Nawab Shah delegation, raising one hand above his heavy head, barely smiling, his cheeks too full and his mouth too tight to smile because he had put on too much weight. Zulfi arrived late, but as he entered, the crowd of more than 1,000 jumped to their feet, chanting Jiye Bhutto and Qaide Awam Zindabad. Tallest of Masood Mahmood's Federal Security Force guards surrounded Bhutto, covering him with cat-like care and precision wherever he went because there had been many rumors of assassinations moving down from Balochistan or Afghanistan and the frontier, or possibly heading west out of Delhi or Bombay. hired guns who would try to kill this great new leader not only of Pakistan but of the entire Islamic world, for he would soon host the summit conference in Lahore that would bring to his side the king of Saudi Arabia and the presidents of Libya and Syria. So there was more security and less pressing of the flesh. As Zulfikar Ali Bhutto climbed to the dais and started to speak, but the roar kept him waving and smiling. For these were his people, his party, his family, the party he had conjured up out of his own enchanting mind and spirit, which he led alone. Others like Ministers J. A. Rahim and Dr. Mubashir Hassan had helped him organize and launch it. Yet, where would any of them be now without their Qaid-e-Awam? Bhutto had brought Pakistan's first steel mill into being and was gathering weapons of science and secret knowledge that would soon bring the nation more power than any of his mediocre military predecessors had even dreamed possible. With those devastating floods of August and the quadrupling of crude oil prices since the Arab Israel October War. However, his major problem now was to find money enough to do all the things he still had to do in order to achieve his destiny, to reach those golden goals he had set for himself and the people of Pakistan. Ample money was here in Karachi, but the private bankers and greedy capitalists, the Habibs and Haruns, all of whom were jealous of his brilliance and greatness, just as Ayub had been, would never give him the financial support he so desperately needed. None of them understood the urgency he felt, the pressure of racing time, the imperative of fast action, and none of them truly trusted him. Zulfi knew that, which was why, at the formal dinner that New Year's Eve, when he briefly addressed Karachi's industrial and banking leaders, Pakistan's capitalist elite, he reassured them that they had nothing to worry about. The wild rumors that he was about to nationalize all banks were not so. He calmly waved aside their concern, raising his glass for one last bubbly drink before he left for a more pressing engagement. On 1st January 1974, as a New Year's present to the people of Pakistan, Bhutto announced the immediate nationalization of all banks. The doors and windows through which thousands of millions in hard currency had fled the country during the past 2 years were closed. The banks were secured by Bhutto's Federal Security Force guards. They too were part of his present to the whole people of Pakistan.